I'm Pam.
I'm Tess.
And I'm Kat.
In a world changing faster than the time it takes to brew a cup of tea,
High Tea Mystique reminds you that no experience is too big or too small to teach us something about ourselves.
Join us for a cup of tea as we steep into adulting, womanhood, independence, and more.
Love is Blind in season 5.
You and Love is Blind.
I love that show.
I haven't seen much of that show, no. I'm more of a too hot to handle gal.
Ooh,
Yeah.
spicy.
I know, I love the spice. But Love is Blind sounds interesting too.
Let me tell you, if you like spice, watch Love is Blind season 5. You don't have to watch anything else. Just watch season 5.
Just season 5.
Just shows you how toxic they all are.
I mean,
Ooh.
no commentary because I'm not going to give anything away. But
Thank you.
just know that it is quite a ride. And I think, I'll be honest, Kat, it's more of a ride for me because I've seen how other seasons have worked, you know? So this season 5, it just feels like if you're watching this season coming in, it's like, oh my God, this is such a spicy reality show, you know?
Huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw the first few episodes, I think, of season 1 back when it first came out.
Mhm.
And I think it was just a time for me where I was giving all of the shows a shot and I was overcommitted, you know, so I like fell off of all of them. So I got to get back on it and I'll try watching it.
Yes.
But just
do
this
it.
season, that's good to know. It's good to know that I can just
this
jump in.
season. Yeah. Just jump in and enjoy
There's no like
the ride.
returners from a previous season.
No.
Okay.
No.
Cool.
Every season is brand new people. So, yeah.
Amazing. Just to mention it, Survivor is still the greatest show ever created on reality television. There is a new season out. I have mixed feelings about it so far. And more to come.
Hot,
I don't
hot
really
stuff, hot
like the
stuff.
characters right now. Well, I guess they're regular people, but whew,
I feel
we'll
like
see
the
what
only
happens.
actual reality show I've watched a lot and I've already seen all the seasons has been The Circle.
Oh, I love The Circle. The
Yeah.
Circle is
Yeah.
so wholesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember
For
there
the
was
most
a
part.
time where you and Pam were talking about that show a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a good show.
It is.
All right. I think I'm gonna cut off that reality talk and start entering a little bit of a spooky realm. So, in case you guys haven't noticed, and for those of you who are joining us via video, we have a little bit of a different setup today. You know, life happens, but we still got to be on that grind. And so today's episode is brought to you virtually, but together with the power of technology.
Technology.
Yes. So today's episode is actually one that might bring a lot of complex feelings. I'm personally excited. Some of us might feel maybe we're prepared, maybe we're not, but we'll find out. So today's episode, we're going to be diving into the topic of death. And before we start, I know that we usually, talk about the tea and everything like that. I did want to give everybody a sort of astrological forecast update, so some things to keep in mind of what's happening at this time, especially in the month of October. So, needless to say, by the time this episode comes out, we will have had a Friday the 13th this October. So, I hope that everybody has celebrated that day, maybe watch some spooky movies to get into the spirit of Halloween. But some other things that are happening this month is on the 10th that already passed by, the planet Pluto goes direct. So what does this mean? Pluto has been in retrograde, and as we've talked about before on the Mercury episode, it means that it looks like it's going slower. Some of the energies are going to be reversed. So Pluto is the planet of death, actually, death and renewal and regeneration. So the fact that this planet is going direct means that a lot of this regenerative elements will be more prominent, right? A lot of things that need to be ending are going to end to make room for things that need to grow. And it's also going to be direct in Capricorn. So this might manifest itself in your life in things that require a lot of discipline. Maybe it's material items. Maybe it's something that you've been working really hard towards that you might have felt, maybe this isn't worth it, or it's taking too long to get there. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of those things now you start seeing the results, the fruits of your labor, everything that you've been working so hard and you've been planting the seeds for would be manifesting. So I would keep an eye out on that. Another exciting thing is that we have a Libra new moon solar eclipse. So this is going to be a powerful day where karmic cycle unfolds around us in relationships, and it's going to, all of the energies that are happening right now are really going to force us to look inwards um, and think a lot about some of the events that have been happening. And the reason that I say that is because this month we also have a full moon lunar eclipse in Taurus that's going to happen on the 28th of October. And this is going to be really powerful because this signals the last eclipse in a series of eclipse cycles that we have been having since 2021. And you might feel yourself feeling a little bit emotional. Some things that have been popping up in the past might be coming to a close, or things that have been, I would take a look at what has happened in your life during the last couple of eclipses and maybe reflect on those events and see if the universe is trying to get you to change a perspective or look at things differently or release something from your life that needs to be let go so that something new can grow from it. And I would take the time to really sit down and digest through all of that, because if not, the universe has a way of bringing things into your life. So if you're not welcoming it, it'll still come, but it'll come as an unwelcome visitor, and it'll be that much more difficult to go through. But I would not, as the topic that we're going to dive into today, I wouldn't be so fearful of it, right? I would just take it step by step and just take the moment to stop and think and pause, because a lot of these energies are going to allow us this moment of quietness, this moment of introspectiveness, to really think about how we're feeling with the events that have happened in our lives. There's also a lot of processing I feel that we may have had. Something that's happened recently is a global pandemic, which has never happened really before. And I'm sure there's a lot of things that have happened after that fact that have probably affected us. So, just a little encouragement for all of us to just take the moment, enjoy the spooky, and also take it all in and try to figure out what this all could possibly mean. Because as we always say on this podcast, everything that happens is for your better good, whether you want it or not. You just have to look at what it's trying to tell you. And I think that's going to be really powerful, especially with Pluto going direct in this month. So having said all of that, I think it's time for us to take a little break, take a little sip of our tea, so that Caitlin can let us know what it is that we're sipping on today. So I'm going to take a sip.
Hello, hello, hello. Thank you so much for a great introduction, Pam, as per usual. It's definitely a good number of words that I'm going to take to heart as well as we dive into today's episode. I think that I'm a mix also. You mentioned some of us are apprehensive, some of us are more excited, and I'm definitely based on the questions that we have for today's episode, I'm the full spectrum of those emotions. But I'm excited, and I also think it's such a wave of relief. Tess mentioned before we started recording that the universe is on our side and that this is all in divine timing to talk about it. So that being said, today's tea. So we have a rooibos tea tonight. It's a full herbal blend because you heard I just said tonight. All of us can be candid and say that we're recording in the evening. October is a very busy month.
Yes.
So
Oh my God, yeah.
Too busy.
here
Yeah.
we are getting it done. And we wanted to do something that would, I think, kind of keep us motivated for the episode, but also, you know, kind of bring us very nice and smoothly to that good night later on today. So again, this is a rooibos based tea. So this is a great recovery tea. This is a great tea for having at the end of the day, when you want to just sit back, wind down, and relax, but you don't necessarily want to go to bed just yet. It doesn't have anything that's going to put you to bed. It actually has a little bit of spices. So there's cardamom, cloves, and cinnamon, which makes it very similar to a chai, but it doesn't have as much of a potency and power. So that's why I say it's a nice boost. And as I think we've talked about in an episode before, cinnamon is also really good for recovery and for your muscles and blood stimulation. So again, just a really nice base tea, something that encourages vitality for you and is going to strengthen you while you sleep to make you nice and strong for the next day. Cheers. Enjoy. And I hope that these episodes, you know, as we talk about all of these different teas, have inspired you all who are listening to be a little bit more, I guess, prudent as you're choosing your teas. And hopefully you're starting to pick ones that are suitable to your mood or how you like maybe want to feel or want to be.
Thank you. And I love that you mentioned that it'll help us really recover, because I feel that it's really in alignment, right, with the topic that we're talking about today and what I had mentioned beforehand with Pluto. So as I had mentioned earlier, today we're talking about dun, 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 death. And if you are watching us in the video, you see we have this skull in our background to kind of emulate that and set the spooky mood for the season. And so death is something that is a little complicated. Everybody has their own viewpoints, their own take on it. Even religions or other spiritual practices have different ways of viewing it. So I think to start us off for our episode today, I would love for us to discuss, how do we each feel about death and mortality overall? So I think I'm going to start with Tess today. If you could give us just some insight on how you feel about death and mortality and your point of view.
Sure. So this is complicated because I feel like there are seasons of my life where I was really afraid of death and I was very aware of my own mortality. Uh, Specifically, to go back to my first real significant season, I was in the summer before my senior year of high school. And all of a sudden it just all hit me like, oh, after this year, that like I'm an adult. I'm not a kid anymore. You know, I'm going to be on my own. What is my life going to look like? My life is going to end. So all those things came tumbling down very quickly. And it was very dark. I was very young. I was ill equipped to think about these things. And I didn't really talk to anybody. So it was a really dark topic. And thankfully, going into my early 20s, I was kind of sore about that season of my life, but I had really good friends that I was very open with, and I talked about that part of my life. And it opened a very hard but realistic view of death. You know, I had a friend who, you know, unfortunately, like we no longer talk, but he definitely made death a very human experience. And that's what we would talk about all the time. Like, death is part of life. You know, it's as beautiful as giving birth, right? You shouldn't lessen one ceremony over the other. And I'll be honest, right? It's kind of hard, especially again with seasons of life, to imagine it so peacefully, because, like, for example, a lot of my friends now, um I say a lot, but really it's one of my friends, right, is she just had a son, and it's so vulnerable to think about his death, you know so I go back and forth all the time, right? And I'm sure a lot of people listening can relate. It feels very subjective based on, our own experiences, um, what we've gone through. And I have I have had a lot of death earlier on in my life. And I think experiencing it as a child has kind of morphed it in my head a little bit. It almost makes it feel kind of fantastical sometimes, because as a child, you don't really, especially as a young kid, you don't really pay attention to the nuances. You're just like, this is a big thing. Oh my god, it's such a big thing, right? So death and mortality, like, honestly, I don't even think of mortality as much as I do about death, the finality of it. Do I think about, humans have a deadline? Not really. I think more about death is such a big thing. It affects so many people. And that's kind of my baseline for feelings about the end of one's life, right? Like, how much it kind of ripples into everything else, because that's just how I started, right? I was one of the ripples very early on in my life. I experienced a lot of death, specifically my mom's death. So the ripple was very obvious in me. She wasn't there for a large portion of my life. She died when I was 6. So I really, especially now, have lived my life longer without her than with her. So thinking about death, it always goes back to that, like this really big impact, this really big thing, more so than like um mortality, like a deadline, a suddenness. I almost feel like death that's very sudden and tragic is on a whole other plane than like old age, right? Disease, things like that. Yeah.
Thank you. When you were talking about the ripples, I feel like that resonated a lot with me. I guess I'll go next. Um, I've always had a very complicated relationship with death and mortality. I always thought it was very interesting how usually, especially in the society that we're in right now, right, that everything is so hustle and bustle and go, go, go and grinding everywhere. A lot of us don't take the time to pause and think about our mortality until we have an experience with death, right? Um, I've also had my share of experiences with death, but death is something I don't think I'm necessarily scared of, but at the same time I am. And it's it's something that I still, to this day, I'm trying to figure out how I feel about it, because oddly enough, I think a lot about living and the complexity of it, right? And in thinking about living, I'm also thinking about death, because they both go hand in hand. They're almost like two sides of one coin. So when I think about death and how I feel about it, I can't help but think about life as well. And I a lot of the times at night, I'll have a lot of times where I'm just laying in bed trying to fall asleep and just think about, especially because as I had mentioned in previous episode, because I've lived in a different country and have had that feeling of reverse culture shock, that's also a type of death, right? It's a different kind of death. It's a death of one life. Like as you were talking about earlier, Tess, you were scared to move forward because now you're like, what is my life gonna look like now? Those moments of how I feel about death and mortality have been very complicated for me because of that, right? I've had one life that has died technically, and then a new one has come from that. And at the same time, I've always, as I've gotten older, I've understood the sentiment more and more of that was a lifetime ago, or that was a different chapter in the book, because it's so interesting how it really does feel like such a finality when it comes to different things, from transitioning from grade school to college, from college to career life, and even things that have happened in my life recently where, yes, I've had physical deaths in my life, but I've also had other kinds of deaths, right? Ends of relationships, ends of long relationships. So I think of death in a very multifaceted way. And I think that's why my feelings towards it is a little bit more complicated. And I'm still trying to figure out how I feel about it. And I think when I say me trying to figure out how I feel about it, it's almost like me trying to figure out how I can be at peace with it, because I do acknowledge that it's something that is inevitable, right? It's going to happen. Um, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it could be a bad thing. But I do find myself often thinking about death and how it reflects on my mortality. And even when it comes to things like this weekend, I went to go visit my family for my brother's birthday, and as tired as I was, the only thing I could think about was, no, I have to wake up and I have to spend time with my nephew. I have to make that effort, because I don't know what could happen, or I don't know when's the next time I can come back, or these moments will be fleeting. So in that regard, those are the moments where I almost feel appreciative about my mortality and the finality of it, and realizing to appreciate the present, right? And being present. But there are still, I'm human. So there's still moments where I feel uncertain about it. Um, so yeah, very, very complicated feelings about death and mortality for me that I still have yet to completely put a 100% clear definition on. What about you, Caitlin?
Well, I definitely feel you on like the very like I'm feeling compelled for those very mundane moments. Like I think especially as we get older, like that
Mhm.
wave of like the finality of death and mortality. Like as you get older, it's like doing those mundane things where you're like overcome by it. And me too. Like totally me too. Um so I think for me, I won't really get into. Well, I think that I have to say that as somebody who was raised religiously, for me the idea of death is something that I avoid really. I think I thought about it extremely deeply for a very long time. I think that when I was growing up in the church, it was a big reason why I would go to the church so often. Was because I was afraid of dying, and because I was afraid of dying and going to the wrong place, and there was a lot of fear. And so I think that since leaving the church, I have spent less time thinking about exactly like what happens after death, or like why I live the way that I live in reference to my death. I think that now I would say the idea of others passing is what shakes me up a lot more. I think that I kind of adopted the philosophy of kind of more of a stoic belief, right? Which is, I think it was Marcus Aurelius who said, confine yourself to the present. And that is something that I adopted very early, um, like in breaking out of the church, and has really, like, it's something that I live by. And I find a lot of comfort in that, and knowing that like my life is to make what I have in front of me mean the most at all times. Um, but what shakes me up is when it happens around me. And those are the things that I don't think are really getting any easier. I think that every every passing is an opportunity for me to be a better person because I get to.
Mhm.
You know, I'm very much like of that mentality. And the idea of like, if you want proof of how unfair life can be, right? It's in the people in your life who have gone before you. And like just that alone, you know, like the idea of like repeating, I'm so lucky, I'm so lucky, like little things like that, I think serve for me to never let it mean nothing. Um, I think that there have been like moments as an adult when people who were very, very close to me passed, and I definitely had like different stages of grief from when I was younger, right? Like now there is like a phase of denial more than when I was a kid. You know, I think when I was a kid, I just embraced it wholly and didn't like let anything pass me by. And as an adult, I think that we numb ourselves. Well, myself, I can only speak for myself, but I think that I struggle with that. And like there were when my grandfather and my godfather passed away. They passed away 1 month away from each other, and it was like a moment where I realized that I couldn't do that, you know, and so much easier to say than do, but like you can't just harbor emotions and say that you'll get to it later. That's like worst analogy in the world, but that's like my childhood photos that I say one day I'll make an album of these, you know, and it's like a pile of 1,000 photos. You know, there are so many things that we say we're going to do and we'll never get to, but those are the ones that are the most important. And like society doesn't give us time to mourn, you know, that's on our own time. And it's the reason why I think people are so strong, you know, when we see people like really admiring, appreciating, and properly embracing their pain when they've lost someone who they loved. And again, it's something that I try to do more of, you know, and I'm trying to be much better about that, you know, and of course, like in my relationships while they're here. And I think that's the biggest thing that mortality shapes is like you said, Pam, those mundane moments when I'm like just with the people that I love, surrounded by them, and that wave passes, and it's like, how does that inform what I do next?
Yeah. I don't know if it's just me, but when you said that, like now, right, death really shakes you, I was trying to reflect on the experiences that I have had with death. And for whatever reason, I don't know if maybe it's because it's not a topic that my parents really talked about, or maybe because we weren't as religious. You know, it was the basic heaven and hell thing, but it wasn't really emphasized, right? Or I don't know if this is the right word, but dramatized to that effect, for it to really impact me that way. So whenever I have had instances in my life where death happens, like, yeah, I feel sad, but there's almost a quietness in me. I don't want to say peace because I don't think it's that. It's just like a stillness of, yeah, this is what happens. You know, like life goes on. I will mourn for them, but I'm also hoping, right, that they had a fulfilling life to whatever that meant to them. Um, and what do think about and how I feel about death in terms of myself, like I've always thought whenever the day comes that I pass, I want everyone, and I will say it now officially, I would love for everyone to have a celebration of my life and not a mourning of my death. You know, like I would imagine like everybody, even though people say like, oh, you need a mourning period, whatever. I'm like, do you really? Like, yeah, give yourself the time to process. But I would love it if people could celebrate and have a good time and remember me for all of the good times and the good things that I hopefully have done and how I hopefully would have impacted them, you know. So yeah, just a long way to say I
And
don't.
you already have,
Yeah. Thank
of
you.
course.
And I
Yes.
think that happens naturally because even with like, people's brains, right? I feel like they do things, the brain does things to make pain, right, less painful.
Mhm.
So whether that's like forgetting something faster than you should, right? Or like when you're experiencing death, one of the first things that happens, I think, well, I shouldn't say first, but initial things that happens is you remember how much you loved somebody. You remember good moments. You remember the last time that you saw them. You remember, oh, but we were just talking about this, or we had plans for this. Like, it's, I know there's like a shadow of tragedy around it now, right? Because of death. But your brain is almost saying, like, wait, but they were just here and it was so good, you know? And I think that's really, it's a sweet, bittersweet thing. But I think it's just a trust, Pamela, that will happen.
Yeah.
People will always remember good,
Yeah. I'm always low key worried to make sure I'm not repressing, right? I'm not repressing feelings, but to me it almost feels like when people when I feel or death happens, it's almost like they're not gone. They're just on a trip, an extended trip. Like that's how it feels to me. But yeah. So, having said all of that, I would love to know what rituals or experience we have had related to death in our lives. I know I have quite a few. And Tess, you were mentioning some of them. Um, so I think I want to start with Caitlin this time. So what rituals or experience with death have you had? And I know we share one. Um, so yeah, if you'd like to share.
that you've talked about in a previous episode.
Oh, yeah, we did.
It was a good, because it was what Caitlin was saying, right? It was kind of part of the reason why she adopted like really positive and constructive things. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I would like to start by saying that I went to not too many funerals as a child, but I did go to several, and I remember them all very similarly, which was very um somber and quiet. And I remembered not enjoying them, and just knowing that it was something that I needed to do, and that I wasn't going to be a fun day, And I would say that I even felt this way up until like all the way through to high school. And then um and then that's when when a family member who was actually very close to me passed away. And so I think that for a long time it really did feel like ritual, but just not like I felt like a very much so an outsider to the ritual, because if I was always going to the funeral for someone who I didn't really know.
Mm.
Even my great grandparents and my great grandparents, I was so young, and so I really didn't have a prominent family member pass away until I was a sophomore in high school, and it shook me really, really hard. And I remembered the ritual of pictures, and it's the one of the reasons why I have so many pictures today is because of that, because I realized that once someone is gone, you only have your memories and like the things that you saved of them, and the easiest things to have are pictures. And so we spent, an entire night, because it was all so fast, creating like this massive picture collage of all of these photos of my aunt, and to just like display our idea of her best self, for everyone to see and remember her by. And I can say that now that's something that, like, with my family members who have passed away, it's something that I continue to do, and it can be very, very painful to go through. Children help, like with my little sisters in the passings of like very recently, it's so much easier. Like when you're no longer the child, as you're now the adult and you actually have to like watch out for other people. But I think there's really something beautiful and healing about when you put yourself as close to it as possible. I think you can also get the greatest growth from the experience because it's an extremely vulnerable time, which also makes it an opportunity for change.
Mhm.
And it's also just such a beautiful way to remember them, and like I said, very firsthand. So yeah, so I think pictures would be the most memorable for me. I've also had some enjoyment from going to celebrations of life as well, Pam.
Mhm.
I did just want to echo that. I think that the unfortunate thing is also money, and not everyone can afford to have their family members um buried. And
Mhm.
so a funeral is not an option. It's like there's no one to bury. And so I think that it actually has a great opportunity to be a celebration of life. And those are the ones that I've gone to. And I think it's also just a reality of us, and how fleeting and how everything is a symbol of what you give it meaning to. And I often leave feeling more fulfilled as an adult from celebrations of life because of that opportunity to reflect on only joy, and that the tension is to keep joy at the center.
Yeah, gratitude as well, because then that's where you bring the mindset of you're grateful that they did have the time that they had at least, Side question. Do you have a memory box?
I do. I have three. I have one from when I was like a little baby, like
Mhm.
infant, and like toddler years. And then I have another one from like just growing up. And then I have one as an adult, which is much smaller, actually, now that you say that. It's very
Mhm.
small. It's a little lunchbox tin, but the other ones are much bigger.
What about you, Tess? Do you have a memory box?
I actually have several because I I don't organize them at all. They're just like, oh, I'm going through my room and these are all the things I've found in the depths of drawers and bookshelves and things. And I'm like, this was the era that I cleaned my room in 2023.
I feel like we should have a challenge, like a memory box challenge or a time capsule challenge. Um, and maybe we can revisit this topic again in the future and set a goal of like, I don't know, however
I
many
love that.
years or however many seasons and just
Yeah.
reflect on what were things that are important to us at this time in our lives, how
Memory
have
is a
things
magical
Challenge.
science.
Challenge accepted.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That means going through our boxes too.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, you're right. You're right. I probably got a couple of weird letters from exes in there. So fun. Gotta burn
You
them.
can replace them with better pictures of the now.
I will. I will.
Yeah,
Call to
Yeah.
for
action.
sure.
Yeah. What about you, Tess? What are rituals or experiences with death that you've had?
So I think I want to start off with an experience because I was actually talking about this experience with a friend earlier. Earlier, like I think about 1 or 2 days ago. So I will say that my first death was actually my uncle's death, my mom's brother, and that death honestly felt very much what Kat was describing. Like all, I didn't really know what was going on. I was 4 when it happened. But I do remember the building. I remember the mood in the room. I had no idea what I was doing there. And I didn't realize it until I was maybe like 13 or 14 because I was talking about this memory with my brother. My brother was like, yeah, that was our uncle's funeral. And I was like, oh, that does make sense. Yeah, that falls in line. And I felt like that memory was just exactly what Kat described. So that's why, like, when I was listening to you, Kat, that's the first thing I thought of. Like that was my first time at a funeral. That was my first time, even though I didn't know it was death, I was around it. But for sure, right? When my mom died, I was kind of aware that something was going on, but I was 6 years old, so I could only know so much. But I will tell you that this is such an interesting analysis of death because kids don't have a definition, right? And I was never told this is what's happening, but I knew something had happened and I felt it. Like it was the thinning of the air in the room, the kind of quiet that you're talking about, Pam, in my head. Like something was just plucked, like from right behind me. And all I felt was like that, like, whoa, you know? Um, this was not a funeral. I won't talk about her funeral because that was very strange. But when I went to see her in the hospital, right, the day that she had passed away, that was such a strange experience because again, nobody had told me anything, right? And I actually found out much later in life that my dad knew she had passed away, my grandmother knew she had passed away, but we were all in a car driving to Gainesville, right, to go see her in the hospital. Presumably, that's what like I thought as a kid. And they took us to this weird waiting room that was like a dentist's office waiting room. It was terrible. And I was so impatient, I was getting so frustrated, so that when I finally got into her room, I was extremely taken aback because she was, and again, nobody had told me anything. She was laying in her bed and she was holding a rosary in her hands because, again, we're Catholic. And I remember looking at that and thinking, that's so dramatic. Why is she holding a rosary in her hand? Knowing or not knowing anything, right? And I remember looking around the room and seeing so many people that I recognized. Like my aunt was there. I had no idea that she got there. My grandparents' friends were there. I had no idea they got there either. My godparents were there. I was like, oh my God, like what, how did I not know all these people were here? And I was like taking like my environment in, and everybody was so like, it was just the saddest. Like I don't think there's ever been a room that has had that temperature of just depression, right? Than it was like walking into my mom's hospital room. And I remember looking to my brother, he is 2 years older than me. So he had a little bit more, I think, uh, ownership, right, of what was happening. And he just had a different rosary in his hand. And I recognize this rosary because in our Catholic school, it was the same like textbook rosary that they give everybody after they do their first communion. And he was like smashing it in his hand against the chair. And it was the most polar emotion, right? Like everybody somber and sad, and it felt like weak and so like oppressive. And then I turned to my brother and it was just anger and activation and aggression. And I was like paralyzed, right, by this. And if I'm being honest, that's a microcosm of, I think, what happens every time I experience a death. And I feel like what I see outside of me too, right? Um, Death is a hard thing to process in our lives. And especially, I'll give it out there to literally every child listening to this. If you're out there, you are so extremely intelligent. And I know this because I was a child that adults were too afraid to like tell her what was going on. And I figured it out. And to this day, my my adults, right? And in that time and era would tell me like it was too hard. It was too hard, Tess, to tell you what happened. And that's someone speaking to me who was like 30 or 40 years old when it happened. And here I was 6 just putting two and two together, And again, when it happened like 2 years later, when my aunt had passed away, nobody really sat down and spoke to me, but you knew, right? Whether it was another, illness, she was sick, right? You kind of guess that something serious is happening with like the hospital visits, and she's she went through chemo as well. My aunt also had a type of cancer. So it was, whether it be the medical diagnosis, right, or just that feeling in the air, your mind is very smart, and it starts to kind of prepare you for this, even if you don't know it. So it was I think it's a very intuitive thing, right? Which we're kind of unraveling how intuitive it is. Um, One of the most interesting rituals that I've ever experienced that had to do with death was actually a so it was a funeral that it was well the ritual happened at a funeral that I attended that was for one of my friend's sister. My friend's sister had passed away very tragically, and at her funeral, right, her friends had all gotten everybody to wear white, which was really impressive for a room full of Catholics that are like, only Santeros wear white. But they all agreed to it. And that was very impressive. And they read her diary to people. And it was like also the hardest thing because people were just not okay. That has to be, and I guess also power to those of us that keep a journal, that keep our memoirs, our memory boxes close to us, because that is literally what you leave behind. At the end of the day, there is nothing that can undo pages and hard commitment of thoughts and fears and insecurities. There's nothing that will unwrite those words. And her friend was reading aloud like her last 5 entries, and it was so beautiful because somehow, right, just like we're seeing in these episodes, a lot of things are so um serendipitous. And she had written about her daughter, and she wrote about how much she was looking forward to seeing her grow up and seeing her learn how to drive. And that was insane. Of course, thankfully, her daughter she took it in really good stride, but that was pretty intense. So that probably has to be one of the most significant rituals I've ever witnessed. It left a really big impact, and I think it also made me appreciate kind of like my own craft of writing, and keeping mementos and all these things, and like my nostalgia was just kind of proven valuable because of how it was brought up in the situation of just pure sorrow and dread. So I felt so connected to death in that point. Um, and funny enough, maybe like a year or two later, I actually found one of my mom's diaries, and it was
Oh,
like the
wow.
years. Yeah, it was like spanning, and every entry she dedicated to just writing about me and my brother. Like, oh, Javier did this today, and oh, Tessie made this joke, and it was a really, and funny enough, right? It's a ritual that we do in life that very much transcends our passing and our leaving of this physical realm. So I always tell people, like, keep a journal, especially if you're parents. Your kids will maybe get to know you, but they will never get to know you as well as like with you and your intimate thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing.
And like as they age as well, like as they can really like begin to understand your thoughts too.
Yeah. It got me to know my mom a little bit better in the lens of like her motherhood too, and what she was afraid of and what she hoped for us. So that was really special. I always recommend it to everybody. Keep a digital diary, keep emails and you give your kids the password and username later on, that you send them. I've seen some people do that, which I think is super special too. I fully love like that ritual, right? They're kind of similar to cat, like something that happens in life, but again also transcends. It moves on or helps with our process of death. Yeah.
Funny because when you said diary, I immediately thought of like the diaries I would keep when I was little and be like, oh no, I wouldn't want someone to read that. But if we journal and have those kinds of diaries, like you really shifted my perspective with that. And I might consider writing more. Um, but yeah, thank you for sharing that. Um, I feel like all of you, right? And we seem to be discovering a common theme here. My very first experience with death and being in a funeral that at least I can recall from memory was when I was little, and it was my grandfather's death on my mom's side. And I just remember we were in Peru and everybody around me was sad. They were crying. Again, nobody explained to me that I can recall what was happening. I'm not really sure why. I think perhaps it had to do with that kind of generation, right? I feel like the generation now likes to explain things to their kids because either more studies are known or it's talked about more that kids are capable of handling more than we think, right? Speaking to what you were saying, Tess, like, kids have an intelligence there. We just take it for granted. But nobody ever told me anything. And so I remember looking around and thinking, what's going on here? Why is everybody so sad? And then it kind of clicked in my head that, grandpa's not here anymore. But I also didn't really have a lot of strong memories of him other than those that I would see in like home videos. But of the deaths that I do remember, that one of them being the one of our friend that Caitlin and I shared, I remember that really, for all of our friend group, right, made a lot of us think, I think, about our youth. And for me, especially, I know that for Caitlin, it really was a catalyst for really focusing on her career and in drama. But for me, it was more of a realization that we are not as, what's the word? Invincible as we think we are. The youth, we love to believe that, or it's very easy, right? Because we're so present to think that we are invulnerable to certain things, that we have such a long life to live because we're so young. That was one of the first moments for me where I really sat down and realized, like, dang, like maybe we should chill out a little bit with all the partying that we were doing, or even with how it happened, because it was so unfortunate. Because I feel like I surround myself with fairly responsible people, right? And the way that death happened was truly unfortunate. Our friend was dropped off, and the friends that were with him, made sure that he got home safe. It was just an unfortunate decision that he made on his own, to go back out again. But that really showed me, like, it doesn't matter how hard you can even try, you never know when it's going to happen. And then another experience that I had that I think was very, I guess, like the timing, I could tell that it was very purposeful. So when I had gone to Japan, the first time I went was for a study abroad program. And that was when my family really reconnected with my dad's side of the family, because we're usually closer with my mom's side. We hadn't really talked a lot with my dad's side of the family. And a part of his family was his oldest brother that moved to Japan. And so because I was going to Japan for a study abroad program, they didn't want me to be alone. They were trying to figure out if there was a way that they had a family member who could pick me up or help guide me. So that's when we really reconnected with them. And then lo and behold, when I get accepted to the JET program and I went through it, during that time, that brother of my dad became ill. Like he had lung cancer. And I remember very clearly that they were telling my cousin that he only had, they weren't sure how long he had. It could be a couple of days, it could be a couple of weeks, potentially a couple of months, but that they really were not sure. And I remember calling my dad and telling him and his family and telling him, you have to come this weekend. And he's like, oh yeah, no, I'm talking to my brother. We're trying to figure out if we can go next week. And I was like, no, you have to come this weekend. They don't know how long he's going to take, but I'm telling you, you need to be here this weekend. And so they finally came, and I picked them up. We visited my uncle at the hospital. The other brother stayed with him, and that evening, after he saw his brothers, and mind you, my dad has not seen his brother in Japan, and his brother had not seen him for so many years, probably over, I would say, even like 30, 40 years, to the point where they told each other, I think if I would have seen you and we crossed each other, I wouldn't have recognized you. So to have his family almost reunited by an unfortunate circumstance, right? But to have them all there, that night, my uncle passed, and it was almost as if he heard that his brothers were coming, and so he was holding on, right, until he got to see them again, and he got to be reunited with his family again. And that was something that I could tell, like, this was the reason why I needed to come to Japan. This was the reason why I was brought here. And the ritual that I experienced over there was really interesting. It was
I
something
love this
that
story so much. Sorry, Pam. I just have to interject on how much I love this story.
it's okay.
Okay, continue.
So I'm not sure. I think it's a Buddhist tradition, but it could be a Shinto tradition. I'm not entirely sure. At the moment, my cousin and my family, they didn't really understand because they had never gone through a funeral in Japan before. And there was a lot of pain and confusion because it's not something that's really practiced, I feel, in a lot of the world. So when my uncle passed, the decision was made to cremate him. But there's a ritual where all of the family members who come for the cremation, they're given like blessed chopsticks, right? And each family member is supposed to take turns. Like they showed the body, the remains. The Buddhists were very respectful, and were saying that my uncle must have been someone who was very hearty and very healthy prior to his illness, because he still had a lot of good bones that were intact. And we each had to take turns. I'm getting chills just talking about it. We each had to take turns with the chopsticks and grab a piece of his bones and put it into the jar. Like that was the ritual that everybody, it's almost like the family members interweaving and taking part of this experience and putting him into this vessel. And then, it came to a point where they respectfully again were saying, that he had strong bones, and that with as much as respect as they could at this moment in time, because the bones were too big, they were going to, break them down so that they would fit in the jar. And it was a part of the process. So we started putting some of the bones, they filled the jar, they had to push them in a little bit. Then we continued the ritual until everybody put the bones in, just one bone, right? One piece of bone. And then once everyone had their turn with the chopsticks, then the priests or the Buddhists finished putting in the rest of the bones in the jar, finished pushing them in, and then they sealed it and they gave it to my family. And at the time, during the ritual, there was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of anger, right? This isn't something that was familiar to them. I remember my cousin feeling very hurt and not understanding why that wasn't explained to her. But, the friend who was there helping them out, the Japanese friend, for him, the assumption is that this is his norm, right? Like this is the norm in this country. So I don't think it occurred to him to explain to him, this is how the process works for a funeral. So it was very interesting to witness that and experience that and realize whole countries have a different way to mourn and even process a body, and then eventually my family came to the conclusion that, it was it was nice to know that those were his, because they've also said that they've heard stories of people not knowing, they're, not really knowing with a guarantee if these are the actual bones. So they saw that the body was placed there, it was in the furnace, we waited, and then afterwards, we went through that. It was a very intense experience. But it was also nice to have everybody there and share it, because in a weird and twisted way, all of us had experienced that for the first time. I don't even think my cousin's kids, who were born and raised in Japan, they hadn't gone through that either. And maybe death wasn't really something that they had experienced during that time or up until that time. And so this was their first experience too. So in an odd way, it was almost like a nice thing that we were all experiencing this for the first time. But at the moment, there was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of anger. But yeah, that's my experience, or the rituals that I've experienced with death. Other than that, I feel they're the typical, funeral, and a lot of discussion, a lot of storytelling after is what I would say is a typical ritual, right? But that was an
That's such a
interesting
good
one that I've
point.
experienced. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's such a good point, and I think like that's storytelling about death, or storytelling after somebody dies. Like, oh, you remember this? You remember when we did that? I love those moments too after death.
Mm-hmm.
But Pam, like that story, I remember when you first told me this story, and I was just, my jaw was on the floor. Like that was,
Imagine me being there in the moment.
I know. Oh God, chills.
Yeah.
Um, that type of like uh close contact with, I think, probably the hardest thing to do, like somebody you love or a family member's body. That's an intense thing, and that's really, I think, so formative, in how we see and how we navigate, right, our feelings about death. Is like, okay, how much intimacy have you had with the idea? Well, literally picked up the bones myself type of
Yeah.
intimacy. Like that's insane.
Yeah. It was rough. I'm not gonna lie, at the moment, especially being surrounded by the instant reactions to it, it was really hard. But at the same time, there's almost like this morbid beauty to it, right? Because it is that. It's this idea of we're more interactive with it. So it's almost like I could feel it more, and it was a little bit more spiritual than just going to a funeral. Um so yeah, very, very interesting experience. Little scary at the
Oh
time.
yeah, for sure. I'm
Yeah.
sure all of ours, I think, is like there's an element of, there's an outline of fear.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So that leads us to our last question for this episode. Are we scared of death? I know we've talked a lot about some of the experiences that we've had and how the definite feeling, I think, of uncertainty, but ultimately, are we scared of death? And I think I'll start us off. Um, Interestingly enough, I don't think I'm scared of death. I think I've thought about that question a lot. Like, am I scared of dying? And I feel that at this point in my life, even though there's a lot of things that I hope I live to experience, I feel good. I feel good in my life that, God forbid, if something were to happen, I'd be okay with the life that I've lived so far. And that kind of brings me a little bit of peace. And interestingly enough, on the flip side, I'm almost scared of living more because I'm terrified at the idea of growing old. And I could not tell you why. I think it's an irrational fear potentially, but the idea of just growing older, and I'm constantly thinking about that point in time where you get to that point where you have almost like a mind body disconnect, because you think that your mind thinks it's still capable of doing all these things, but your body might not be able to catch up as it used to. And so in that regard, I'm more scared of life than I am of death. And at the same time, I have thought about a lot about different ways to die. And I think that's natural, to just be scared of how I would die. But actual death, I don't think I'm scared of. What about you, Tess?
I was actually gonna say, let me go last because I'm still thinking.
Okay. What about you, Caitlin?
Thrown to the wolves. I am not scared of death. I feel like I have fears, I guess, like it's definitely not something like it's not like it's not on the list of things to just be fearful of, because I want to
Mm-hmm.
stay alive as long as I can. I do want to have a long, fruitful life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I'm not afraid to die. I think I'm one of those people who's more afraid of like what Tess said earlier. I'm more afraid of what other people will have to experience after I die. I'm more fearful of like what my partner and my parents, if they have to see, like worst case scenarios, are my fears children if I have kids. Um, but the idea of death itself, I don't think I'm afraid of it. I think that I'm someone who it hasn't, I've had trying to figure out how to word this, but I'm just going to be vulnerable. I've struggled with suicidal thoughts. And so I think that because I've considered death as a way out before, I actually think that I'm in a really powerful position as a human being with the choices that I make. And, there are crazy things that can happen in this world at any point of any day. But I'm really blessed, to have been born into the life that I have and with the awareness that I have and like knowing how to take care of myself and protect myself. So for me, I think the idea of death is more of a rational fear, sure, but it's something that's more of like I can keep it to the side and not have to let it be a part of my everyday. But I do think that those moments where I really struggled with my mental health, I think that I was more afraid of death than I wanted to give myself credit for. And so it's from those experiences that I've developed the relationship that I have now, and like dealing with them in the proper way to understand why I felt like I could take death into my own hands.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that too. I know that's something that's really vulnerable to say. I was actually contemplating bringing that level of vulnerability myself. So I'm kind of glad that you brought it up because I almost feel the same way, and maybe that's why I feel so at peace with the concept of death in that way. Because I also, like when I was younger, I also had suicidal thoughts, and I think that the reactions of how people would take my death in that scenario is what I'm more scared of because it was something that came across my mind. But because it was also, like how you said, something that I've thought about and contemplated, I'm almost at a point now, like how you were saying, where I feel in control, at least more in control than I used to. And I would love if we ever feel up to it. I personally take suicide and depression and mental health very seriously. It's part of the reason why I have such a huge interest in psychology and want to expand that part more and learn more about it and how the brain works in that way. And I think it's also so important and so relevant, right, with everything that's happened with the global pandemic and how that's affected millions of people. Um, because I've also had experiences with friends, right, with suicidal thoughts and the idea of death in that way. And I think it would be amazing if one day one of these episodes we have a talk and we discuss about mental health and suicide and depression, and hopefully do take the time to do research, and provide you all with some good resources out there, because it is something that I am passionate about and want to do more work with and be involved in more, with that awareness, with how we can help people get the help that they need, because it's so important. And one of my friends actually is he works in HR, but he also has a background in mental health, and that's something of his that he's also passionate about. So hopefully in several ways we'll be able to manifest support for that. But yeah, I think that's important to acknowledge. So I'm glad you brought that up, because not everyone experiences that, and a lot of people do experience it, and it's not something that's talked about and often brushed to the side, as is death, right? As we've talked about earlier today, it's not talked about to kids. So I'm glad that we brought that up in this episode, though. Thank you, Kate.
Yeah, of course. And count me in if we decide to do it as a topic, if that's what our listeners want to hear.
Yay, we'll find out. All right, Tess, you think you're ready? Ready or not? Here it comes.
So I've been back and forth, right? But I think I've decided, right? And I will say that I am afraid of death. I am. And I'll start off a little silly just to give us some, humor relief here. I am afraid of missing out on like Avatar number 5, Like I want to see all the movies. I want to watch Love is Blind season 19. I don't know. I feel like one of the silliest things but it always comes up every time without fail, is like, but if I die, I won't be able, like, what if they finally decide to like uh make a make a Twilight show on HBO? I don't know, right? I'm just being silly here, but
FOMO is
there are
real.
so many FOMO, yes, that's fueling my fear of death. And on a more serious note, I fear that I'll miss out on, like, which I'm sure, funny enough, every parent fears as well. Like, I want to see my loved ones experience things, right? I want to see my children grow up, right? If I was a parent, I want to see my children. I'm not a parent, right? But I'm speaking, to kind of let the listeners know where I'm coming from. I'm afraid to miss that one person's wedding or the birth of their, first child. Like I had mentioned her before, one of my friends, she has her son. Like I think of my mortality now in terms of like, oh my God, like, am I gonna see, like him, like his wedding day? Like, and I'm doing the math in my head, like, how old will I be? So I do fear death for those reasons. Everybody has their time. Um, Funny enough, I know I mentioned Avatar as a joke before, but now, since I guess it came to my frontal lobe, I thought of this quote too, that in Avatar they have this belief of death that, you borrow energy, right? So you have to give it back. And I think that's the deal that you always try and extend. You're always trying to see more, because your life expands and you grow your network and your family starts expanding, whatever that looks like for you, whether it be blood or your own choice. And you want to see all these things and you want to be part of so many things, and you feel like death may stop you from a portion of those things, right? Of course, a lot of us think of it as kind of like death and, when we're old and, old age, right? But it could be much sooner, as we've discussed, So I do fear that. Like, what if I'm gonna die? And like Star Wars episode 13 is gonna come out in theaters like the next month, like will JJ Abrams let me preview it like he did before? So I think about that, of course, and really I really do think about the movies I'm gonna miss out on. And of course the more serious things of the moments in life that I want to share with people I love that I may not be able to. um and I think I inherit that fear from the women in my the two most prominent women in my life were, especially as I was a child, my mom and my aunt. um my mom and my aunt were such pillars of, I guess, strength and also parenting, right? Obviously my mom, everybody kind of has a very strong relationship with their maternal figure. And my aunt, like when my mom passed away, my aunt had moved in very swiftly, and she wanted to take care of me in that sense, like very affectionate and passionate and very disciplined, like she didn't want me to miss out on like the love and strictness of a mother. So when she passed away very quickly of lung cancer, I knew somehow, right? And this is going to be such a strong thought. I mean, at least I think it is, because I look back at like my 8-year-old self and I'm like, damn, you kicked ass, man. Like when I was 8 years old, all I kept on thinking was like, I'm going to be there for my cousin. Obviously my aunt who was sick, her daughter, um I'm going to be there for her. I know exactly what this feels like, right? And I'm going to make sure that my tia doesn't feel like she's missing out on anything. Like I was in such recovery mode that it was ridiculous. And I needed to calm down, but I was just so thinking, or so consumed in thinking about what my aunt was probably fearing that she was going to miss, you know, like my cousin's wedding day, right? My aunt unfortunately didn't get to experience any of that because she had passed away, but I knew that that was her fear, so I think that's something I inherited, from them, especially watching two mothers that kind of had to leave their children so early. And I felt very much that fear. So I feel it a lot too. Even if I'm not in that same dire situation, but I do revisit that feeling often. And I think sometimes it's me revisiting them too, especially when I was part of a benchmark of one of my cousins. And I was like, what my aunt would have given to be here, you know? So I think that's really why I do fear death, not only for what I'm going to miss out on, but what I think so many people have already missed out on. And it's painful. So it's like that teardrop effect, right? That thing that we're talking about. We're not just, I don't think any of us are just talking about like we're afraid of this blackness, but we're so afraid of this connectedness that we've had to people in our world now, that we know it's going to leave quite a bit of pain. So we're very conscious of that. Yeah.
So hearing you talk about all of that makes me want to ask one more hot take kind of question, right? How do you guys feel, or what is your current perspective on the afterlife? Like, is there something that comes after death? And I'm particularly interested with where you guys are currently on that perspective, especially considering that you guys come from a more religious background than I do. So I guess I'll start with Tess.
The quick answer is yes. I do think there is an afterlife. I don't know what it is.
Okay. Not the typical hell or heaven.
You know, I came up with that belief. So that's definitely foundational for me, And I won't lie, it's an imagery that comes back to me every time I think about the afterlife, but I have felt very significant, which is maybe something we'll get in on a different episode. It's kind of spoopy. Um, but there has been some blurring of the lines for me when it comes to the afterlife and this physical realm. Um, so I don't know if it's heaven or hell, but it's definitely, it feels very parallel to where we are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. What about you, Caitlin?
I think that I closely, if I were to say one that I think I resonate with the most closely, it's the idea of reincarnation. Um, I find a lot of peace with knowing that my soul is eternal, and I think that the beauty of my life is getting to know myself and understand myself more, because I have this overwhelming sense that I've always been, and it's my journey to discover parts of myself that have always been there, that have always been true. And so the idea of reincarnation sits really well with me because of the lives that my soul has already been through, and will already go through. But it gets a little, I have much more thoughts within it, and I think the realm and how exactly it works. But just to give you a short answer, I do believe in reincarnation.
Thank you. It's interesting. Mine is kind of like a blend of you guys, where I don't know if I particularly believe in a hell. Um, I feel like bad people will get what's coming to them, right? Because I'm a very firm believer of karma, and in that sense, the essence of that the soul lives on, and more of like the energies that come with it is what I believe in. So I don't know if I particularly believe in reincarnation in the sense of we come back as a frog or we come back as something else, but I believe that the energies or like residual energies of our soul may be present in those ways, right? Or may manifest themselves in those ways. And because I believe so much in karma, that's why it's almost like kind of believe in heaven and hell, but in the sense of like, yeah, people will be there protecting us, sense of heaven, like angels, sense of heaven, but not this, I guess, paradise. It's not like a physical place. It's all energy revolving around us and almost like recycling itself, right? So very similar to what Tess was saying about Avatar. So yeah, thank you ladies for sharing. I was just really curious, I wondered if there were any similarities or differences with our answers, so it's nice to hear. All right, so we talked a lot today. It's kind of been all over the place, but as is with death, right? And I know Tess, you were saying that at this moment in time you are scared and you were kind of back and forth with whether you were or not. I'm sure, before my answer would have been differently, right? And my answer has evolved. So I'm sure our answers may potentially evolve in the future as well. And those of you listening, you might be even struggling with how you feel about it, which is completely normal. So today I decided for the tarot read to use this beautiful deck. That's the Guillermo del Toro deck. And I picked it because it looks super spooky, and I'll put the image here of what that looks like. And I thought it felt super appropriate to our theme today and the spooky vibes that we're starting to enter. But as we were having our conversations with death today, I very clearly wanted to just pull a single card. And I want it to be something. I'm going to leave the interpretation up to the cards in terms of what message they want to give us regarding death, because I think there's so many different ways to look at it. There's so many different people, potentially so many different kinds of perspectives that all of you are listening come with and bring to the table. So I would love to just keep that a little bit more open today. So whatever message that the cards may have on death, that they would like to share with us, a single card pull, and we'll see if it comes out or if I have to. Oh, okay. Not a single card pull, but 2 came out. Okay, I'm gonna keep these in mind, but I think I'm gonna ask for a single one, please. We want clarity. We want, this is such a complicated subject for some people. So if you could just give us one card for us to focus on today.
Simplicity.
Yes. Especially with something that some people may have a hard time with.
This has been one of our most serious topics.
It has.
Yes.
How do you guys feel now while I'm waiting for a card pull? Do you feel good that we talked about it?
I feel good. I forgot to mention that after my uncle passed away, my godfather, I started seeing squirrels like everywhere. And like that's something that I think to this day is like I still see them and think of him, which I always thought was so incredible because squirrels are signs of mischievous, like of mischief. And yeah, like mischief, troublemakers, rabble rousers, and always looking for excitement and joy. And that was exactly who my uncle was to like every single person who knew him. And I thought that I was going to be able to fit that in somewhere. So now I can.
Now you can.
Yeah. But hopefully that's a little lighter too. Cause it's like, it was like the funnest thing that came out of it was like, now I see them and I know it's always my uncle saying, "Hey, what's up? I see you." And it's always when I'm doing something that he would approve of.
Mischief around the house, Caitlin. That's what I hear.
I feel like the cards do not want to give a single card. They're like,
nah.
this is too complicated.
Yeah, not tonight, guys. Not tonight.
Let's see. Please give us one card. I'll accept more at this point. If you got a lot to say, I'll accept it. I feel like I'm going to go with just the cards that came out originally. I think the cards are a little upset with me of putting them back.
They're like, take it or leave it. Take it or leave it.
Yeah. So I do remember what they were. It was the star card and the fool card. So let me just go ahead and take them out and find them in here.
It was the star and the what, Pam?
And the fool.
Interesting.
Yes.
Very interesting. Looking at you, Kat, and your mischievous uncle.
Oh my gosh, yes, the fool. Wow. Wow, that's crazy. Actually, I guess it was right after.
Yeah.
So Pam drew the cards and then I proceeded to talk about my uncle. That's
Yeah.
incredible.
Okay. It is going to sound kind of lame, but when you were saying that, Kat, I had like this vision of water because my mom was kind of synonymous to water for me for a long time and I didn't know why. So when Pam said the star and the fool, I was like, I wonder if that's why water came to my mind.
Could be. And I will say that afterwards, some of the cards that were popping up had a lot of water in them. So maybe your uncle, Caitlin, was coming out with the full energy and your mom, Tess, was coming out with some of that cup energy. Okay. So we have the fool and the star. And I just want to also find the actual descriptions because these depictions are different from the typical, right? So I want to make sure that I read everything that these cards have to say. So for the first one is the fool. And I'm going to see. Nope. Okay. We'll just put it up. So the fool in this deck says the fool is the only tarot card that is not numbered. Perhaps the reason is that it needs to be put aside. For many scholars, tarot is a path and the fool, not one of its steps. Wait, I'm sorry. For many scholars, tarot is a path and the fool, not one of its steps, but the character who walks through it. Oh, I see. For many scholars, tarot is a path, and the Fool, not one of its steps, but the character who walks through it, which is kind of what we were talking about in our tarot episode, right? That the major arcana goes through the Fool's journey and the hero's journey. According to this idea, we find a character with no previous identity. All possible paths unfold before him. From his wooden spoon hangs a minimal pack, and a strange pet bug follows him. That bug, a mantis, symbolizes instinct, and we can't be sure if it is a threat or a playmate. In this deck, the Fool card is inspired by the fawn from Pan's Labyrinth. The Fool, like the fawn, is a primal being that can adopt the roles of both a jester and a mystical pilgrim. He can be a mysterious wanderer, a threatening intruder, or a frightened and lost child. All these meanings develop, as with all the cards, depending on the position of the card, upright or inverted, and the cards that surround it. In personal matters, the Fool speaks of merry unconsciousness and lightness. When it appears inverted, it becomes the lost one and speaks of disorientation and even dementia. In matters of love and friendship, it brings a certain lack of commitment, which is aggravated if it appears inverted. It almost never suggests a good capacity for business unless it has to do with improvisation or sudden inspiration. In the presence of the world, the Fool signifies a happy ending to a process. I can't do Roman numerals 13, some transformative event. With the Wheel of Fortune, especially if inverted, the return to the starting point. With the Magician, the necessary preparation of the tools for the journey. In the presence of the Hanged, the pilgrim is blocked, paralyzed, or lost. And there's a quote here from Guillermo del Toro that says, "The saddest journey in the world is one that follows a precise itinerary. Then you're not a traveler, you're just a tourist." Wow. And for the star card, we have a maiden kneels under the stars. She is submissive to the cosmic order and receptive to its energy. One star rules the whole image, and 7 smaller ones surround her in harmony. There are 7 virtues, 7 planets known in the classical era, 7 days of the week, 7 chakras, 7 alchemical metals, and 7 steps of transformation. There are 7 colors in the rainbow. The world was created in 7 days in the creation myth of both Judaism and Christianity. For many traditions and teachings, 7 is a number of totality and perfection. In the best known tarot decks, the star shows a naked maiden pouring water from 2 jugs into a river or pond. We can feel a connection between that action and the energy of the stars. For Tarot del Toro, Ophelia, the main character of Pan's Labyrinth, has been chosen to represent his lovely card. She has dropped the jugs and is holding a book while fairies flutter around her. It seems that her work is done. Ethereal energy is vividly manifesting itself through a naive, childish, carefree, and therefore deeply powerful character. The star is always a happy card in a tarot reading. Under the star's rule, everything takes its rightful place in the order of the universe. To find our true objective, we must accept our guidance. With the Empress, it acquires a certain sensual character that may attract others to the right path. With the Lovers, it guarantees balanced and mutual romantic relationship. If the Emperor is placed under its light, we can glimpse a triumph that does not take advantage of others and that will bring lasting satisfaction. The star leads the chariot to a good destiny, inspires justice, and puts an end to the fool's wandering by turning him into another archetype that will follow a clear path. It gives a practical sense to the magician and a very convenient anchor to the inner mazes that the moon may present. Inverted, she becomes the mirage and can guide us deep into the desert through illusionary appearances and superficial claims. With the magician, she may indicate a tendency toward exhibitionism, and with the moon, great insecurity. And there's a quote here included from Pacific Rim that says, "When I was a kid, whenever I'd feel small or lonely, I'd look up to the stars." So things that come up to me immediately, right? Is number 1, clearly we have to watch the movie Pan's Labyrinth. Clearly there's something in there. And I think, the fact that two of these characters, like of all the characters, right, that he has, these are the two that come up, and two of the main characters in that movie, right? And if I remember correctly, that movie is also kind of talks about death in its own way, right? And just suffering in general. And
Yeah,
so,
Ophelia's mom is pretty sick throughout the whole movie.
yeah. And so the fact that with the Fool card, usually it's talked about as in a very positive light, right? Oh, it's your chance to take a leap of faith, lean into that foolish energy, have fun, be spontaneous. But what I really enjoyed about this tarot deck, and what I thought resonated really well with the conversation that we've been having today about death, is it's all dependent on the placement and even the image of it. It's not your typical fool who's out and about and looking to leap into the fields, right? It's the Pan from the movie, and he's kind of hunched over, and even the cricket that they show behind him. Usually you see a dog in the traditional depiction of the fool. It's a dog that leaps with the fool, and dogs are usually something that you immediately know they're going to be good, right? But in this version, the cricket is what accompanies the Pan, and you can't tell, is it good, is it bad? And I feel like it resonates a lot with all of the conversations we've been having about today. Two sides of the same coin, something that is inevitable, and it's something that can help us reflect to the way that we're living. One of the things that also stood out to me is this idea, like that quote, right, that they decided to include from Guillermo del Toro, that says, life without spontaneity is like you're not living, you're just a tourist. And it's almost warning against being on autopilot, right? Which is something we had even mentioned in this episode earlier, that death is something that really helps people take a pause and reflect on their own life. And are you living it to the fulfillment that you're looking for? And how something so tragic forces us to look at the life that we're living. And this being paired with the star and this concept of, even looking at it now, that cricket that's in the Pan with the Fool, with the star, it has wings and it's flying. So it's almost, to me, saying that death is kind of what we said, right? It's multifaceted, it's very layered, it's a very heavy topic, but also can be very light, and it's all up depending on how you look at it, especially with the description of the Fool and how it says that depending on how it comes up and depending on what it's paired with. And this is one of the first times that I've read in a tarot deck book, right, that comes with a deck, that with the description of the card, it really emphasizes and talks about how the meaning can change, because that's something that you might learn about with the layouts of cards and card pools, but not necessarily with a card description. So the fact that in this deck, the Fool card, the very first one that has no number, right? It's like death, and it's a beginning and an end. I thought was very in tune with everything that we've been saying, and how death can be, it all depends on how you react to it, how you choose to see it. It is inevitable. It is there to have us look at something, whether it be our own life, and make that realization that we have been living life on autopilot and we haven't made decisions for ourselves, whether it be inspiring us and take a look at children for inspiration, right? That's something that Tess had mentioned in this episode as well, and how children really help with the concept of death. So lean into, childhood and the innocence of that, and go and explore, or just look at it differently. And at the end of the day, everything that the star card, because usually when the star card comes up, it's this idea and a significance that a wish is coming true, right? But with how this particular deck describes the card and how it might shine a guiding light with one thing, or be a little bit more lighthearted and just a dream come true with paired with a different card, in the underlying meaning, it's still ultimately the same, right? It's this otherworldliness, however you define that for yourself, that is showing you, that is guiding you, whether it be your intuition, whether it be your spirituality, whether it be your religious belief, that the death may not be as morbid or as final as you might think it to be, right? I know that a lot of the times with death, some of us may have the reaction where then we feel stuck, or we feel, what's the point without this person? And I think these cards are really, especially with what we had started this episode with, right? That astrological read, or that forecast, that we are in this cycle of transformation, right? That's what I think is really echoing throughout this whole episode, throughout this specific time period that we're recording this episode. And maybe at the time that you're watching this, you know, you might be in a very transformative season in your life at the moment. And so take a look at all of those things. What's changing? What needs to change? If things haven't changed, why haven't they? There's a lot of almost nudge towards introspection with this encouragement that things will be okay. And I think ultimately that's the message, right? Like, it will be okay. Things will be okay. And a reminder that with death, there's also life. So make sure that one death doesn't cause the end to the life that you're currently living. And make sure that you live the life that you want. Because the star card is here. So, and even with the description earlier, right? The Fool card is indicative that anything is possible, good or bad, depending on how you see it, but anything and everything is possible. So that, I think, has been really powerful. As I was reading it, I don't know if you guys saw in the video, but I almost was laughing at, like, oh, look at how well this matches. But yeah, I really hope this episode helps some of you. Even at the time of recording this, right? We're in that transition phase from autumn to winter, and slowly stepping into seasons that are more quiet and are more calm, and maybe a little bit more difficult for some people, especially for those of us who live in colder areas with longer periods of darkness. Don't forget that stars are out there and light does come out in the dark, you know, the moon shines as well. So just don't get stuck. You know, I think that's what the cards are really warning us against, this potential for being stuck, you know, because after winter comes spring, and things will continue cycling and cycling over and over. And if you don't get the message now, it'll come again in a different way. So just know that you have the power. Even though we're talking about something morbid and we're using such a very spooky looking deck, you know, good cards came out. And especially the star card, which is one of the most beautiful and indicative cards of good things are to come. Especially, I think, with the fact that Pluto is going direct. It's like, now's the time. Now's the time to take those steps, because once you do that, oof, the world is your oyster. So yeah, that's it for the tarot read.
Thanks for the read, Pam.
You're welcome.
I think it's amazing that you pulled the Fool card when you wanted one card and you got two cards.
Yeah.
And one of them was the Fool, who was like, you thought
I know.
you had a plan. No way.
I know, right? And then when I kept shuffling, things would not come out as many times. And you know, I wanted one card because I knew I wanted clarity. But to me, it makes sense that not just one card comes out, because it's such a heavy and difficult and complicated topic. So, lesson learned. Even me, you know, with all the tarot readings that I've done.
Yeah.
Sometimes we need some practice with our intuition, and sometimes the cards are very stubborn and they'll tell you, you know, this is it. You're going to take it or take it. Not even take it or leave it. You're going to take it and take it.
Yeah. Talk about breaking an itinerary.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, with that being said, is there any last minute thoughts that you guys have for our listeners today? No.
I
Oh.
honestly just have a renowned gratitude for those deaths happened and the birth of the podcast came to be.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this has been going on since 2021.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
You are
So,
absolutely right.
kudos to us. We
Yeah.
survived. We were birthed out of this eclipse season. So I think it's just up from here, gals. It's just up from here.
Oh yeah, it's just up from here. We're entering the age of Aquarius. I think it's going to be just a beautiful journey that's going to come for us. And I'm actually really glad that you mentioned what was it again, the way that you phrased it.
Solar eclipse season?
No, the way that you've looked at what happened, right? And you're almost grateful for it now, because one of the things I also want to encourage you all that are listening is to look at the Pluto is a planet that is transformative. And so things will happen that may seem out of your control, that you're trying to figure out, like, why is this happening to me right now? But I just want to reaffirm for you, if you're kind of going through that you may not understand it now, but you will in the future. You know, as I've mentioned before, I'm a firm believer that everything happens for a reason. And so I was really glad when you had said that you're realizing now that those two deaths, and you said it, right? Two hard things, two hard truths that you had to learn about yourself. And now you're grateful for them. And a lot of the times when things happen to us, especially tragic things, we may not see how it fits into our story. But it's there. And so take a moment to try to think about those things and take a look at 2021, reflect since 2021 and think about what's happened since then. Maybe you'll have some revelations as we did today. So with that being said, I want to thank all of you for taking the moment in your drive, in your evening, whatever time, whatever place you may be hearing us today. And very grateful for your presence and grateful to hear how much this podcast, how much you all enjoy it, and how much for some of you it's really helped you. That has always been my ultimate goal with this podcast. And even when we talked about in the very early stages of this podcast, in the planning stage, it's something that we unanimously agreed upon, you know, that we would create a space that would be safe and encouraging for everybody to be vulnerable, but also be lighthearted. So I'm so grateful for this space. I'm grateful for all of you listening to us and for you two ladies joining me on this journey. And I can't wait for us to see ourselves in the future and have this as our own personal diary and little memento to the world to look back on and laugh about. So with that being said, we hope you have a great day, night, evening, bedtime, and we'll see you in the next and final spooky episode.
Spooky episode.
Look forward to it. Bye.
Thanks for tuning in.
Happy Halloween, everybody.
Soon.